All right, good morning. This is the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. It is Tuesday, May 2nd. We will start our day with a roll call.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Ackerman.
Here.
Commissioner Cross.
Present.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Oath.
Here.
Commissioner Ray.
Here.
Chair Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Very good. Well, this is a special meeting. We are going to hear a report from Director Murphy and Commissioner Ackerman with regard to the work they and we have been doing around cumulative impacts. With nothing further, I would recognize both of them for a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So if you'll give me just a moment. Should be seeing the presentation now. Does that look right?
It does.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I certainly will defer to Director Murphy if she wants to make any introductory comments, but other than that, I'm happy to jump right in. So Director Murphy.
I'd say jump in, Commissioner.
Okay, thanks so much. Just wanted to defer in case you wanted to say anything. We really appreciate everybody making time this morning to talk about this important subject. We've certainly been doing work on this, and a lot of work's been done to date. We're excited to talk about next steps. That time has come for us to start to discuss it. And so we expect this presentation to take, 20 to 30 minutes or so, and some commission discussion afterwards. And we're going to talk today, kind of remind you about the state of the cumulative impacts process, what we've done so far, where we're at. And then the bulk of our presentation is going to talk about some ideas centered around what we think some suggestions for the next steps might be. We'll talk a little bit about the structure, the proposed structure and setup of the potential stakeholder group or stakeholder groups. And then we'll kind of end with a discussion about, deliberation about what we've presented and potential commission actions today. So just as a reminder, during our scoping phase, during the first quarter of this year, we asked for issues that would be within the COGCC mission and purview and certainly consistent with Senate Bill 181, and also that they be issues that are reasonably actionable, issues that we could take under advisement and think about taking some action on. You'll recall that during the first quarter, we had 4 listening sessions and we had written comments as well. A reminder that we had just fewer than 300 people attend those listening sessions. And we had 124 individual comments in writing. And you might recall these diagrams from the presentation at our March 15th meeting when we reported on what we heard from the listening sessions. And we broke down, we kind of amalgamated all of the input that we received and broke it down into 4 primary categories: the administrative category, the scientific category, the social category, and the biological category. And each of these had, some subcategories underneath them and even some subcategories of issues under there. All in all, after everything was compiled, we talked about at that meeting about 150 separate issues that had been raised during those listening sessions. At that time, we reminded you that we were working on the annual report, the Cumulative Impacts Annual Report as well. And you heard about, you took a look at that report. It was presented by Director Murphy. And you might recall that at our last meeting associated with that report, we had the opportunity for public comment. We had 23 responses to the annual report, and we said that we would take those into advisement in the cumulative impacts process as we try to merge these 2 processes together. And you might be able to see the text on that, but you might not. In the end, we didn't have really any new things come up pertinent to the cumulative impacts process that came up during the annual report. We did have one item, inclusion of API standards in the report itself, that was pertinent to the report that hadn't been mentioned during the cumulative impacts process, but all other things had been mentioned and incorporated into the issues that were presented from the listening sessions. You might note that there's a large red slice in this pie that's associated with the opposition of new regulations. As you recall, we had a number of people stand up and essentially talk about the current state of oil and gas and that it was robust and well regulated and that no new regulation was needed. that was pretty contrasting to the cumulative impacts listening sessions where there was an overwhelming majority in support of exploring new regulations. So we definitely have both sides of this issue that have come up multiple times. And so that's kind of where we sit with the internal cumulative impacts process. I'll kick it over to Director Murphy for a bit of a broadening of the landscape and to talk a little bit about potential next steps.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think that alongside our stakeholder process, there have been a couple of important ongoing activities that dovetail nicely with this conversation and are important to consider. First, from the governor, we have two important executive directions. One is the Environmental Justice Action Task Force implementation letter from March 1st. And, you know, as context, in 2020, we adopted important regulatory protections related to protection of disproportionately impacted communities. That was in advance of some important work implementing legislative direction on environmental justice. And I think that conversation continues. That Environmental Justice Task Force recommendations came out this fall. And I think it's important to keep in mind that everything that this agency does is within the ambit of that work and is being guided by that work and will continue to be guided by that work. And we need to specifically pull that work into this process. The second one is a couple weeks later, the governor made an announcement on reduction of nitrogen oxides. And that is in partnership between COGCC and CDPHE, and in particular their Pollution Control Division, to work collaboratively on three primary goals outlined by the governor in that space. And we are continuing to do that. And given the overlap between a number of the comments that we've heard around emissions, NOx, greenhouse gas, like there are a lot of related components, right, between what the governor has directed us to do and a lot of the stakeholder commentary about cumulative impacts and how we manage to it. And so we need to make sure that the work that we're doing today, again, is under the umbrella of the work that the agency and the state is doing on both of these executive branch directives. I also wanted to flag that the legislature is still in session. There are still discussions about cumulative impacts occurring, and we're continuing to watch to see what action the legislature may take on that front. Session is scheduled to end in a few days for many folks. Those days are stretching into feeling like millennia, I suspect, but we'll continue to work on that front as well and monitor it. Next slide, please. So for me, today is really about kind of this first step of having this broad feedback, and there was a great breadth in the feedback. And sometimes in stakeholder conversations, there are specific clear themes that are very easily actionable, right? We think about wellbore integrity. Stakeholders really came together and were on the same page, and it was easy to go straight into a regulatory process. I think on cumulative impacts, we've heard a much broader discussion that then needs to be stakeholder to congeal around or coalesce around more specific recommendations. And for me, there's an interrelationship between the buckets that Commissioner Ackerman has laid out in the 4 different colors and circles, and how I've been thinking about it, which is kind of how, what, when. And what we need to do is bring those two together, and either of those frameworks could be opportunities for defining a stakeholder group or phases within a stakeholder group or different discrete elements of a stakeholder group. And that's what Commissioner Ackerman is going to get into next. I'm kind of giving some foreshadowing here, but that for me is kind of the conversation. As I think about cumulative impacts, it is a broad term with a lot of different facets, and it has the flexibility of, it is less, it can be interpreted a number of different ways as compared to like cementing standards. Again, not to go back to wellbore integrity, but it's an easy place to contrast the two. And so I think that we do need a lot of really focused work on what it means for this commission to implement the directive and when to continue to implement and continue to iterate on the direction from Senate Bill 181 to evaluate and address cumulative impacts or the potential for cumulative impacts from oil and gas in Colorado. We do have a framework understanding, having a stakeholder group understand where it is today and whether there should be more or different is part of the conversation. So for me, it is this interrelationship between the broad and varied feedback we got about how to then make it actionable that will be the focus of a stakeholder group or groups. And with that, I would go to the next slide. And then kind of talk about, I guess, reiterate what I've just said a lot, which is how are we parsing these into applicable subject matters? How are we then operationalizing these? We need to get stakeholder groups and then move into some recommendations. I also know that folks have reached out affirmatively either to Commissioner Ackerman or to me or through our web form. And I think we either Brett or Commissioner Ackerman or I will be in touch with those folks this week to talk about their interest, where they see their expertise aligning, and then also having a very focused and intentional outreach to environmental justice groups. And with that, Commissioner Ackerman, I would turn it back to you.
Thanks, Director Murphy. I appreciate that. And as Director Murphy pointed out, this is a little bit of a lion to get our arms around because it is so broad. There are a lot of issues, and you might recall from our March 15th meeting that they were very broad. And that's, of course, made more complex by the reasons that Director Murphy just pointed out, that we have potentially overlapping processes as we talk about the governor's directives and as we talk about potential legislation coming from this session. And so there's a lot of parsing to do of issues to make sure that we don't have conflicting and or overlapping processes together with this cumulative impacts process. And to be honest with you, we thought a little bit about, waiting a little bit to kind of let that landscape clear a little bit more, but we have committed to moving forward in an expeditious fashion. We think we can do so in tandem with those two issues, with those two other complex backdrops, so long as we're careful about what we discuss in the cumulative impacts group and how it does or does not overlap with the other processes. So we've given a lot of thought to how we might structure groups going forward. And really, the floor is wide open. And this is really a lot of the discussion that we wanted to have with you today about what you believe the most appropriate structure going forward might be for a stakeholder group or stakeholder groupings. As Director Murphy pointed out, and this is probably small text, I apologize for that, but we've just put forth kind of three options here. I don't want you to think these are the three options that we have vetted and said, these are what we need to do. These are three options that we're putting forward for discussion purposes to kind of help spur some thoughts in your mind about how we want to move forward. And so, of course, one of the obvious paths forward as we've parsed these issues out into four broad categories might be to have four stakeholder groups that are associated with those categories. One associated with administrative, one biological, one social, and one scientific. There's some benefits to having multiple groups if you've been involved in multiple group processes before, and there are also some real difficulties associated with multiple simultaneous groups addressing overlapping subject matters. So this, of course, a pro of having broken out groups in this structure or in any other, breakdown group framework structure you might have, is that it does allow for appointment of more specialized stakeholders into each group and allows for more specialized discussion and input. It also, if you have multiple groups going on, allows for some simultaneous discussion rather than more linear sequential discussion. But it is a more complex approach to have multiple groups. You certainly will have overlapping issues in cumulative impacts discussion. And it really often results in a less holistic point of view and rather a more siloed recommendations that may or may not be disparate from one another. The obvious option to having multiple stakeholder groups would be option 2, having one stakeholder group. And in this case, when you have one group discussing the issues, you'll get to have pretty holistic prioritization of the issues, and the issues that are of the most interest or the most controversy or that need the most discussion will most likely quickly flow to the top of the discussion and become prioritized with regard to one stakeholder group. It's also much more likely to produce more cohesive recommendations across all subject matter. But this can be a more lengthy process. It's sequential rather than simultaneous. And certainly, depending on the size of the group, could potentially reduce the specialized discussion in favor of kind of a more broad holistic approach. And something that we'll struggle with one group is that it could potentially be very large. We want to be very inclusive. We want to make sure that all interests are represented at the table, and that could result in a potentially large group. So those are kind of the two primary looks that we had, but we certainly are open for discussion here today or at a later date about this or some other model. There are lots of other ways we could go. For example, one of the things that we've pondered as a potential alternative, many of the comments that we received as part of the listening session were associated with the direction associated with data, the gathering of data, the compilation of data, and which we're all doing a pretty good job of doing right now, but could be improved. And then a lot focused on the use of that data, which was a big focus of the listening sessions, that we're gathering data, but that we haven't used that data to set limits or to inform regulatory actions or anything like that. And so with that many comments and the primary subject matter of interest being associated with data, it could make sense to form one group and just focus on that issue, the data gathering and the data use recommendations, which will touch a lot of the issues that came up. Of course, the pro of that is it really does, at least in my opinion, focus on the crux of the issue, the scope, the type, the quality, the amount of cumulative impacts data. And then it allows for the discussion of how we use that data to inform regulations and permitting and many other aspects of our work. A con of using that kind of a focused approach would be that it's less likely to be directly comprehensive of every single issue that was raised during the scoping process, but really is more of a focused approach to what we think might be the crux of the issue. So that's an example that we put out there for something other than a simple discussion of every issue that was brought up during the cumulative impacts process. And I know that's real quick. Certainly, we could talk all day about potential permutations of data groups. And so I don't want to go too far on about that and leave that open for some ideas and discussion amongst the commission, should we choose to do so. Something that's important when you put together a stakeholder group, obviously, is to put together a framework, put some clear boundaries and statements. So, I wanted to just kind of introduce you to this. This certainly could be discussed more at a later date as well, but wanted to make sure that. And I also wanted to point out that you received a letter from a group that stated that they were a cumulative impacts coalition that talked about some of these ideas. And I wanted to point out that we appreciate that letter, appreciate those groups that are reaching out still about cumulative impacts. And one of the things in that letter, as you saw, was to make sure that we're inclusive and robust and make sure that we include all sides in a stakeholder group. So this is a example mission of our stakeholder group and has a lot of adjectives in there, but in the end, we want to be inclusive. We want to make sure that we have all of the seats at the table that need representation. And we want to make sure that the intent and understanding of that group is not to direct, but to discuss a suite of issues as assigned, and then result in clear recommendations to actionable items to the commission. And so that will require us to set forth some guiding principles when we do call together a stakeholder group. And again, want to mention balance of interests. This is something that probably raises to the forefront of this discussion each time it comes up, is that people want to make sure that all seats at the table are balanced and that they're not weighted in favor of one side or another. It's important that the folks that participate, it's important but not absolutely imperative that folks are somewhat knowledgeable about cumulative impacts issues. We can have subject matter expertise present to the stakeholder working group on a variety of issues, and we will. But it's good if they understand from a broad scope, the issue going in. But what's more important in any kind of stakeholder framework is each person's ability to understand opposing viewpoints and to have objective conversations that are fact and data based. We want to make sure that, of course, as Director Murphy pointed out, that we are conforming with the Environmental Justice Task Force goals and the other directives set forth by the governor and potential legislation as we move forward. And then we wanted to kind of float this idea of professional facilitation. You know, we've got a lot of great personnel in COGCC, but this we think is a task force that might be best served by outside professional facilitation. So wanted to float that idea to the commission as well when we do pull a group together. And then, of course, I think that the thing that most people would find the greatest interest in is what does the selection process look like? And we can't exactly answer that question yet, as we're still discussing what the group itself, what its framework might be and what the structure might be. So apologize that we're not ready to discuss that just yet. We need to have one more step of discussions before we're able to talk about the exact composition of what that group would look like. But as Director Murphy pointed out, we will reach out to those who have expressed interest, both through the forum and individually, and hold follow-up discussions, as the director has pointed out. I want to pause right there and just kind of thank all those who are listening that have expressed interests. I know that you haven't received feedback since your expression of interest, and so this is our first opportunity to talk about your expression of interest, and we will be reaching out to you. We also want to encourage continued interest in participation. If you have not had an opportunity to sign up or to express interest, please feel free to do so. And you can certainly do that directly to me or to Director Murphy. And then ultimately, you know, it will come down to seating members on the group. It's on the group or groups. It's likely that we will receive more interest than we have opportunities for seats. And so we'll need to at some point make decisions about how to select and approve the final composition of the group. And it's important, I think, that the commission and the director are able to weigh the participants, make sure that it's balanced, and meet the goals that we've set forth here to select and approve a final group. So those are still broad in scope because they're intended to spur a discussion with the commission. It was pretty quick, but essentially what we're asking from you here today is, I mean, the commission is always able to simply make a decision and move forward and give some direction, and we certainly could do that. What we're asking here today is, you know, to answer any questions or have any further discussion that you want to have. You could direct further examination of any specific options and refinement of those options, and we could coalesce those into a more pointed presentation about the next steps and actually propose alternatives for the next steps. We could do that at an upcoming hearing that would also allow for some public outreach and public input associated with that direction. Or we could also simply take those recommendations under advisement and seek further information, continue to monitor the backdrop of legislation and other groups that will be pulled together and are being pulled together associated with the governor's administrative directive orders and any potential legislation that comes out of session, and reconvene and talk more about that landscape when it clarifies a little bit. So we're pretty broad and wide open. I would remind the commission that we have had several requests to be expeditious in how we move this forward. This is a very big and complex issue. It will not be as expeditious as some people would like. But that said, we would like to move forward in a very deliberate fashion as well. We also have had those that have said, hey, you know, let the current rules mature a little bit before you move forward. So again, a broad scope there. We want to make sure that we're being responsive to the stakeholders as they continue to express significant interest in this issue. So with that said, Mr. Chair, I know it was broad, but that's our current thinking and our current suggestions for discussion for the commission.
Great. Thank you both for the presentation. Very helpful to try to initiate sort of the framework on this. I know we're going to all kind of weigh in just a little bit without, I don't think, really making decisions, but just responding to what we just heard. Couple of thoughts from myself, just because I'm already talking. tend to like the concept of one stakeholder group as opposed to multiple. Multiple seems to me to be, it could get unwieldy. And it seems like we might have factors kind of going in different directions as opposed to moving forward on this topic collectively. I do like the concept of a professional outside facilitator. I think that could really help our stakeholder group as it moves forward. A third notion for me is I would put money that we've got more people that want to be involved than we can accommodate. In other words, if we have one group, I think we need to make sure that we have representation from all the various important stakeholders. I don't know that that means that every single person from every single stakeholder viewpoint necessarily gets to be fully involved. I think we need to create processes for full involvement for everybody. But when you're talking about task force or a stakeholder group, you've got to create something that is workable in terms of voices that are heard. And so, I think we need, all the various viewpoints, environmental, industry, local governments, COGCC, CDPHE, CPW, you name it. And then each one of those viewpoints has, a couple, 3 representatives involved so that we create something that is workable. So I think those are my initial sort of thoughts in response to the good work that the director and Commissioner Ackerman has put together. I look forward to hearing from other folks, and that may assuage me to have other thoughts. Who's next? Commissioner Oath?
Yeah, thank you. I have a question, and it's not so much about the options, but kind of more general. So as I've been kind of sitting with the EJ task force recommendations and kind of what was laid out there, as I understood it and was part of it, it was, okay, let's first get some resources and directive to develop some cumulative impact analyses on a pretty broad community-wide scale, in recognition that we will not likely be able to accomplish that for all disproportionately impacted communities in the state. And so it would be a limited subset of them. And then the next step would be for agencies, because of the diversity of kind of the types of decision making that we each have, would then have to undergo a process to kind of figure out how then do we apply apply those impact analysis in our decision making, right? How do we take them into account? How do they inform our decision making? So I think my question is, this conversation seems to be about kind of that second step of like, how should COGCC take into account those cumulative impact analyses when they're done, or if there aren't some, again, acknowledging that we're not going to have them for all communities, how should this commission consider cumulative impacts in its decision makings? In what realms? Like, is it in rulemakings? Is it in permits? Is it coming up with a plan? Like, is it? So I guess I'm wanting some conversation or just maybe answers around, like, is that what these options are about? Is that step?
If I may, Chair.
Yeah, Director Murphy.
Thanks. Commissioner Oath, I think it's a both and, per usual, right? I think on the one hand, how some of the broader statewide initiatives are being addressed and incorporated through the EJ task force recommendations and moving forward at that statewide level. COGCC is going to have to continue to iterate to incorporate that work on the one hand, right? But I also think it's incumbent on us, as we're engaging in this stakeholder process on cumulative impacts, to also deal with the pieces that we can at this level, right? And continue to try to strike the right balance to make sure that the voices are in the room, that we have the opportunity to consider them, that we look at our 300 series rules that do have considerations for disproportionately impacted communities, and look at whether we need to better or differently refine those requirements in particular, in line with how to engage with the community and with environmental justice advocates, and as we integrate this into our process as a whole. So I don't know if that helps, but I think it's really both for me.
Commissioner Ackerman, did you want to weigh in?
I will, yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I agree with Director Murphy that this is something that she and I have had considerable conversations about, and appreciate you bringing it up, Commissioner Oath, that this really, your point really illustrates the complexity of the multiple backdrop issue that we brought up, that, you know, when we started this, our intent was to move forward with cumulative impacts based on data that we gathered, based on the rulemaking that we'd already had, and based on our interest in having further discussion about holistically addressing and assessing cumulative impacts. Since we began that discussion, as Director Murphy pointed out, these other backdrops have dropped, which do make it more complex. So I don't have a very clear answer to your question, other than the place that we landed was, in order to move forward with many of the cumulative impacts issues that may not be related to the point that you brought up, it was important to continue to keep that process going. But as part of that process, I think your points are very important, that as we discuss those issues with the cumulative impact stakeholder group or stakeholder groups that we pull together, that we continuously and constantly monitor and understand as a group those processes that are going on under the other directives and under any other potential legislation, so that we're not conflicting with effort, we're not preempting effort, we're not duplicating effort, but rather tracking that effort and being additive to that where we can, you know, and since this is a COGCC process, being able to provide recommendations to the commission how to move forward with potential regulations from the COGCC side, but in a way that's in concert with the discussions that are moving forward on other fronts, including the one that you talked about. So it's honestly, it's a pretty difficult task. But I think that if we're diligent about it and we continue to keep the group updated on those efforts and monitor, and we are very careful about setting parameters not to conflict or override or preempt those other efforts, I think we can be additive there.
Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner Ackerman and Director Murphy for the overview and the work that's been done on this. I think that at least I've known since the very beginning in the development of SB 19181 and the implementation of SB 19181 that this would be the most difficult topic to address. In fact, I remember when I was being interviewed for this role by the governor and Lisa Kaufman, they asked me what I thought, the biggest challenge of the job would be. And I, right off the top of my head, knew that the biggest challenge that we were going to have to address would be how to implement rules and regulations around cumulative impacts. And I really appreciate the steps that we've taken. And I just want to take just a step back as well and realize that, as we were doing the mission change rulemaking and as we were debating it and taking input and feedback from different stakeholders throughout the whole mission change rulemaking process, that cumulative impacts was a really big topic. And, SB 19181, at least in my reading of it, clearly indicated that we were to, evaluate and address cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And we talked about that during the mission change rulemaking, that it was cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. It wasn't cumulative impacts of all point sources of pollution in the state, but it was how do we address cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And I think that still needs to be our guiding light. And I understand that there's lots of different stakeholders that are bringing in kind of new and unique elements to the cumulative impacts discussion. But the discussion that we had during the mission change rulemaking really focused on, how do we evaluate and address cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities? And it directed not only the COGCC, but also the CDPHE to evaluate and address the cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And so, as I'm looking at this and I'm listening to the feedback, I actually think that we were a little more refined in our approach initially in the mission change rulemaking, understanding that we knew we were going to take one step initially in the mission change rulemaking to better understand and evaluate the cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And that's where we developed the CIDR database, the reporting requirements, the different evaluative tools that we have developed and now implemented for a couple of years, I think in a very successful manner. I think we continue to refine that. I think we continue to improve that. But I think that that was an important step, really similar to the option 3 that you're presenting, is how do we make sure that we're refining and understanding that that data that would inform good policy, good decision-making, good rulemakings. And so I appreciate that we took that step. We also had very clear discussions during the mission change rulemaking that there would be future rulemakings in order to, I think, properly implement SB 19181 and the elements around cumulative impacts. And I think that's what we're doing right now. I mean, a stakeholder process like being suggested here right now is a normal and actually required process in any rulemaking process. And I think that, you know, developing a stakeholder process to better refine the scope and the expectations and the details that could be incorporated into a cumulative impacts rulemaking is a really important next step. And I do think that, you know, not every person that has shared information around cumulative impacts is going to necessarily be able to offer to have a seat in a stakeholder process, but they can be represented in a stakeholder process, which is what the stakeholder process is designed to do. And I think it's important to understand that the whatever comes out of this stakeholder process that's being contemplated right now is not the final say in how the COGCC and or the CDPHE is going to address cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities, but rather to give us a place to start as we continue to work our way down the rulemaking process. You know, from this commissioner's standpoint, I do think that this process ultimately leads to a rulemaking. It certainly has gotten more confusing now that we've got an executive direction to take certain steps that incorporate elements of cumulative impacts. We've got legislation around the EJ task force that has information and expectations around cumulative impacts. We've got a handful of pieces of legislation that are working their way through the system right now that are contemplating and incorporating elements of cumulative impacts. And so that does muddy how this process may work. And so I acknowledge that. But back to the beginning, I do think that first and foremost, the expectation of SB 19181 around cumulative impacts was that CDPHE and COGCC evaluate and address cumulative impacts. And that the first step on that is how do we better coordinate activities and communication between CDPHE and COGCC around the topic of cumulative impacts. And so I think that's a really important piece of this conversation that needs to be incorporated into the discussions that we have within the stakeholder process, which is the next steps. I do think, again, that stakeholder process needs to refine its focus to be addressing the cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And to me, that means, you know, the adverse impacts of oil and gas activities cumulatively around elements like emissions and air quality, public health, safety and welfare, wildlife, water quality and quantity, you know, elements like that, where we can be qualitative and quantitative in our approach to addressing the cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities in a defined area, a defined basin, a defined space, and use that as we're looking at developing cumulative impacts. There are agencies that look at cumulative impacts that I think can also help us as guides. And I think, CPW is one of them around, impacts, cumulative impacts to wildlife, or cumulative impacts of recreation to wildlife, or you've got also like transportation entities that look at cumulative impacts of, traffic or population. And so, I mean, this is not an unheard of thing to look at cumulative impacts. And I think that there is a path forward for us to evaluate and address cumulative impacts. And I think that the stakeholder process is a really important one. But I think we also have to make sure that we're addressing our statutory requirement currently, which is to evaluate and address cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And in the discussions we had during the mission change rulemaking, and in my plain reading of the act, that does not include every single point source of pollution in the state of Colorado as part of our evaluation. And so that's just the way that I'm looking at it right now. I think it's a great idea to have an outside facilitator. I would agree with Chair Robbins that as we're doing this, one group may be the way to move forward, so that there is some holistic consistency and everyone's hearing everyone else's discussions rather than the discussions being in silos. I worry that those silos are going to come up with some pretty drastically different concepts. It's important that we're hearing from one another. I think I think that group will be big. I think it's okay that it's big. I think it can't be unwieldy, but I think that a lot of different viewpoints need to be heard, and it's going to take some time to work through that. I don't think that there has to be consensus in the determination of recommendations from that group. But I think that whatever recommendations come out should reflect all the viewpoints that were discussed during the process, right? And so there may be a specific recommendation, but there also should be an opportunity for the viewpoints that may not agree with the recommendation to be heard coming out of that process as well. And I do think that option 3 that was presented is inherent in whether we utilize option 1 or option 2. I think that information, that data analysis, that has to be a part of that discussion, and just becomes a part of the discussions on how we collect, analyze, utilize that data in a stakeholder process, either through option 1 or option 2. I think we learned through the initial listening sessions around the cumulative impact stakeholder process that there is really a lot of inconsistency as far as different points of view on how to first define the scope of, and then how to address cumulative impacts. And so this is going to take a little more time in order to be able to coalesce that, but I really think that Commissioner Ackerman and Director Murphy, you've done a great job starting this process, beginning the refinement, and I'm excited to continue down this road. So thanks for letting me share my thoughts.
Commissioner Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Messner, for those comments, because I think a lot of them succinctly say a lot of what I wanted to say. So I'll try and keep this brief. I agree. I think that the focus of this does, from a broad level, we need to be focusing on the cumulative impacts of oil and gas activities. And coming from a sort of a federal regulatory background in a lot of the legal work that I did, a lot of times that could get very convoluted if you went beyond that, trying to look at what was happening with other industries, what was happening with other sites, what was happening, quote unquote, downstream from what, and a lot of it is things that we don't have control over. We don't have the ability to understand beyond, honestly, a guess of what might be done. Is this going to be something that's combusted? Is it going to be something that's used for cosmetics, for plastics? And not having that kind of information makes that kind of analysis difficult to do. So I do think that it is telling that we're supposed to focus on oil and gas activities. I think it's important that we do focus on oil and gas activities. And so with that, I think that kind of guides my thoughts on some of the options presented today. I'll start off by saying, I think that when it comes to the data option, I'm very much a person that likes to see a lot of data. As a lawyer, I wanted to see as much information as possible before making any kind of strategic decision, before making any kind of substantive decision. And so I think that that's important. But I think at the same time, as Commissioner Messner said, I think that option number 3 is something that will be part of options 1 and 2. And I also think that it's something that we're already doing now, and that's through the CIDR, through the cumulative impacts reports. You know, we've had a couple. Obviously, we're going to continue to get new and improved and updated cumulative impact reports every year. And the more information we have, the better idea we have of what information is going to be necessary. But I think trying to have a separate group that's just going to say what kind of information should we look at is sort of pushing the can down the road without kind of getting to the meat of what we've already done and what we need to do moving forward. I will say, with respect to the multiple groups, the one additional thing, especially based off of the correspondence that we received that Commissioner Ackerman brought up, the multiple groups would also allow for additional participation, because I know that there are a lot of people that do want to participate in the stakeholder meetings, and I do think that might be a way to allow for additional participation. But I'm going to have to agree with Commissioner Messner and Chair Robbins that, you know, I think having one group is going to be far more efficient in what we're trying to do moving forward. You're not going to have people coming up with drastically different ideas, like Commissioner Messner said. And so with that, I think that it's really important to see that one group is looking at all the different options, all the different topics on the table, so nothing's missed, so nothing is contradictory with other stakeholder groups, and everybody kind of gets to see how these could work together as well. And then the last thing I'll say, you know, I completely concur. I think a professional facilitator would be appropriate here, and I think that also would help with some of the concerns that have been raised by stakeholders as well, to try and make sure that everyone's voices are being heard, to make sure that everyone is represented, and having an outside third-party facilitator doing that, whether it's a professional mediator, arbitrator, anything like that, I think is a good way to kind of adhere to those concerns and let stakeholders know that their voices are being heard.
Thank you, Commissioner Cross. Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for everybody's thoughtful input. I don't think there's going to be an easy way to skin this cat. So I do think I agree with my fellow commissioners. I'm worried that if we set up 4 different groups, that they might come up with redundancies or actually conflicting recommendations. And so I think I would lean toward one group that works together. I would be interested in the group prioritizing what key elements we might or should be addressing as our next iterative step for cumulative impacts. I'm worried that if we try to do everything, we won't do any of it really well. And maybe there are some overarching ideas or issues that we should be tackling that would probably also have co-benefits. So if we're looking at what are the cumulative impacts of greenhouse gases and trying to figure out how to reduce those emissions, there will probably be co-benefits, for example, in other kinds of cumulative impacts related to emissions that we see in oil and gas activities. I also think, and maybe this is to Commissioner O's comments, I think what we're trying to accomplish as a commission is cumulative impacts in general, and then perhaps looking at particular concerns or skills or tools that we would want to see used or addressed when we know cumulative impacts have more impact, on a disproportionately impacted community or a community experiencing environmental justice issues. That I don't know that the focus is just on EIP and EJ, but I think there's also this overarching global cumulative impact view that we're looking at what is happening with oil and gas and how do we reduce those impacts to communities in general, and should there be additional focus or tools relating back to the environmental justice task force recommendations that we look at when we know the impact is on communities that have already experienced they're more than their fair share of impacts, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I'll stop there. I think everyone has said mostly what I've been thinking, so thanks.
Commissioner Ray? Commissioner Ray, you're muted.
Sorry, is that better?
Yep.
Thank you, Chair Robbins. First, I just want to thank the Commission for seriously considering how to address cumulative impacts and taking a robust and deliberative process, and appreciate Commissioner Ackerman's leadership in that. I agree with a number of the comments that have been made, including support for one stakeholder group. As I think about it, part of the principle of cumulative impacts is to think about the impacts of oil and gas development holistically. And I think one group that is weighing all of those factors facilitates that. And then the only other thing that I'll add is I think, Chair Robbins, you mentioned and others echoed the importance of having broad representation of interested stakeholders in that group. And I think that will certainly be a key. That'll be a challenge in terms of the size of the group, but I think it's really important in this process. So just again, thank you for this process and appreciate your leadership.
One thought that just come to mind, having listened into the really good input from my fellow commissioners, is it appears that we're all in consensus to do one group. Commissioner Ackerman and Director Murphy, I would also sort of float out there that does not preclude sort of forming smaller work groups on discrete topics that the one group could sort of send out and then bring it back. So I just sort of throw that out as potentially a concept. And then it appears there's a fairly good degree of consensus on a professional facilitator. So I would suggest that if we're all in agreement with that we direct Director Murphy and our budget team to go ahead and sort of figure that out. That might take a little bit of time to get the right person or group on board. So we might go ahead and today provide that direction. Is there anybody in disagreement with moving forward with that? Let me just say this, thumbs up if you're okay with that. Okay, so that direction is generated from the commission to the director and her staff to go ahead and try to sort of figure out the professional facilitator. Commissioner Ackerman?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that summary. Those were some of my questions, and I appreciate you concisely moving us through that. I agree. It sounds like there's a comfort level with moving forward on a proposal for one stakeholder group and professional facilitation. So we will get to work on that. Director Murphy and I will get to work on reaching back out to those that have expressed interest and having further kind of probing discussions with them individually about the path forward. I guess where that leaves us, in my opinion, is the next step would be for Director Murphy and I to work together on a proposed makeup of that stakeholder group. It wouldn't necessarily be the specific individuals at this point that would sit on that group, but the proposed interests of that group and how many seats there would be going forward for presentation at a very soon date. I think the next date that we have scheduled for a cumulative impacts discussion is in a couple of weeks on the 17th. And so I would suggest, if Director Murphy thinks that's okay, that might be an appropriate time to continue forward with an update and a proposal on kind of a framework of what that working group would look like.
Chair, if I may.
Yep, Director Murphy.
I would like to hold the 17th as a possibility. But maybe the end of that week might be a little bit better. I'm in Ottawa for work almost all of next week, and so I don't know that I'd have the capacity to engage with stakeholders in the interim, and that's an important component to me, to start to kind of put together what this looks like with the benefit of understanding the overarching direction from the commission. So I think we could maybe hold the 17th, and if we needed to push it back to maybe that Friday, I'd ask for a little latitude on that front. And I think that also gives us a little more time to have better answers to the questions about facilitator. And I hear you on either having, subgroups or sub issues, but I think that this gives Commissioner Ackerman and I, at least in my opinion, I won't speak for him, the framework within which to engage with stakeholders and start to come back with a more concrete plan with a better idea of deliverable and phases. As I think about the issues raised and summarized by Commissioner Ackerman, both in March and today, as well as kind of my operational type questions, I think that we can think about phases of work for a stakeholder group that focus on what are we trying to accomplish and then how do we get that done. And that might help us have interim conversations and not just look to the breadth of the issues and be overwhelmed by the complexity. So.
Commissioner Ackerman?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to agree with Commissioner Murphy. I was going to make the same point. So I wanted to conclude there and say that I'm on board with that. I think it is important that we continue to take bite-sized chunks. And I guess I would just state to the general public who's listening, I know that there's continued interest in moving forward. I think Commissioner Messner's words were wise and that this is a very complex issue. We've said that from the beginning. It will be complex. It will be difficult. We are committed to moving forward and having the discussions that are important to stakeholders. This will continue to be an iterative process as we move forward, depending on the needs and desires of stakeholders and the backdrop that we talked about and the preferences of the commission moving forward. So complex, but that doesn't scare us away. It will make us deliberate in our approach. And so we appreciate everyone's patience and continued engagement in this important issue. So thanks, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to give some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, fantastic. Good wrap up from Director Murphy and Commissioner Ackerman. I think we've got some good direction for next steps. We're moving this forward as expeditiously as we can, but in a pace that will ensure success. So any further concluding thoughts from anybody? All right, we'll get back together on this topic here in a couple of weeks. Look forward to getting some further refinement between now and then. Thank the commissioners and all those 53 people that are attending with us. And we will be back in touch on this important topic in the near term. Looking for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. We are adjourned. We'll see you tomorrow at our regular meeting.